Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're here today talking about the asking the experts any questions you may have as part of our regulatory roadmap exercise. This is part of the HealthTech program that we're working on with Innovate UK, CPI, as well as the ABHI. The more interesting bit for a lot of people is the fact that there has been a superb response to regulatory grants from Innovate UK to help with a whole range of different projects and work, a really wide scope, and that seems to be going very well. We're also involved in landscaping and engaging with up to 400 SMEs to identify the challenges and seek ways to improve things and make it a more successful environment in which to be a MedTech SME. Beyond that, we're involved in regulatory training, and we'll talk a little bit about webinars, but part of that training is that we can bring our experts in to talk about things. So that would be Steve and Phil, more about them in a moment. But first, just a couple of housekeeping things. If you change the slide, John, we're recording the webinar this afternoon so that you can follow up on anything that, particularly if there's anything that gets too technical, and check it all again for yourself. Please enter any questions you may have into the Q&A box. That is the whole purpose of this session. At the moment, we'll do it via the box, but if there's a need, we'll open up the floor to raise hands and things. But probably at the moment, this is the easiest way because it depends how technical this needs to be pitched at. Follow-up questions, there's an email address there at ukevents@abhi.org for you to .org.uk to be able to pick up any points. So you've got every opportunity to quiz my colleagues here on anything to do with regulation, and we've learned from the landscaping work we've done, and hopefully we've pitched it accordingly. So let me introduce the two main players today. That's Phil Brown, who's the Director of Regulatory and Compliance for the ABHI, a very experienced gentleman, and from personal experience I can tell you he helped me in days when things were really bad, when I was an orphan medical device manufacturer. He knows the right sort of people to talk to, and he knows what's happening behind the scenes quite often. Not that he's going to reveal that today. Steve Lee is the Director of Diagnostic Regulation, so in effect you've got the devices and diagnostics, you've got a very broad range of experience there, and these two guys really know their stuff. So all I'll be doing
just to say, I have changed my shirt since that picture was taken.
All right. Okay. Fair enough. Oh, right. Yeah. Fair enough. See, Steve is totally concerned about being on top of his game. So the idea here is that these guys will be ready to take your questions, and what they don't know isn't worth not knowing about. I tell you, they know everything that, and all we're going to do today is really point you in the right direction rather than necessarily give definitive answers for individuals. That might be a bit tough to do, but we'll see how we get on. And clearly, just at the minute, there's a lot of change happening. But to try and set it in the scene and set our regulatory roadmap, if John, you could put the next slide up. There we are. Now this looks awfully complicated, but Phil sat down and tried to capture all the points that may be relevant to any HealthTech HealthTech SME on their regulatory journey. So Phil, do you want to make some comment on this?
Thanks, Andy. Sure. Do you know what? Thanks for that introduction. I think experience just means grey haired, doesn't it? And I've got plenty of those. So thank you again for the opportunity, both yourself and CPI actually, of sitting in front of so many SMEs. It's one of those difficult things that we do at ABHI, is reaching out to you guys are at the real coalface when it comes to developing and designing products. So it's really great to be with you this afternoon. So as Andy says, when we were starting to think about the program and what we were trying to achieve through the the project here, we were trying to sort of guide you as to the sorts of blocks, if you like, the milestones that you need to sort of reach as you go through a regulatory strategy. So I tried to pitch it out here in those blue blocks to sort of show that you have a design and development phase. You then have a phase where you're implementing and using quality management to deal with that design and development, but then also in the same context, adding in things like safety, clinical evaluations, and your marketing and sales. And then, of course, even though it's slightly wrong, this slide, actually, looking at it again, although your post-market surveillance stuff seems to slip outside of quality management, it's all covered by that sort of process. And then throughout that whole scheme, as you're designing and developing and you're managing your product on the market, you're applying risk management processes as well. So that's one of those ongoing systems. So really to look at those particular milestones, and you'll see that in between those milestones on this slide, there are some titles such as conformity assessment, classification, standards and GSPRs, general safety and performance requirements, clinical evaluation, etc., etc. Those actually relate to a number of webinars which we've put together for you to download and look at. John, next slide, please. So just to sort of give you a little bit of an overview again here, these are the sorts of where you can find these particular webinars. If you come onto the abhi.org.uk website, you can find them and download them. They are no more than 45 minutes long. I think that's the longest one that we've done so far, where we're not sort of using death by PowerPoint. We're just having a conversation with the real experts, and I'm humble enough to know that I'm not an expert in all of these areas, but really having those discussions with people like James Pink, who you can see on two of those slides there of classification and essential principles, but also looking at history and stuff. And my predecessor, Mike Kreutzer, who has a vast experience in what was happening with regulation back in the 60s and 70s, all provides context for what you're doing as far as milestones and reaching those milestones. We've included in those webinars, as you can see, different sections which you can go and have a look at. So if you want to look at classification, but you're not particularly interested in looking at the whole lot, you can go to a specific section in there and have a look at that. So there are, as I say, a number of those webinars which will be online. We're hoping that there will be around a dozen of those from design and development, as I say, right the way through to globalization, which will be the last one that we're doing. Next slide, please, John. So just to, excuse me, add in some context. Should have brought a bottle of gin with me, I think, Andy. Yeah. So when we look at the context here, within the Northern Ireland protocols notwithstanding, where we are still at present having to apply European CE marking to products in order to place products on the market, we have different regimes. And as you know, we have the complication of looking at CA marking in the UK now as a new sovereign process or a proposed process. The consultation for what will be in the CA marking process finished back in November. We've had a response from the MHRA, which Steve and I are ploughing our way through at the moment. And if anybody's got any questions on those, on that, hopefully we can try and deal with them. But you can see on this slide here, you have different routes to market. If your product, for example, is CE marked under the medical device regulation or the in vitro diagnostics regulation in Europe, you can continue to use that CE mark as a route to the UK market. Originally, we had a date of 1st of July 2023 as a cutoff when CA marking was to become mandatory, but we've had an extension to that and a transition through that date, which will allow CE marking at least for another 5 years. And then similarly, if you have your product regulated under the Medical Device Directive and the Active Implantable Medical Device Directive, or even the In Vitro Diagnostics Directive, which are the regulations which preceded the MDR and the IVDR, those too can be used, that CE mark can again be used to place product on the UK market. Although in that instance, you really are bound by the validity of any certificates which you may have or which may have been granted under those particular regulations. So again, look out for those certificate dates. Yes, Steve.
Bill, just to say what it should say in all of those columns is certificates or declaration. And of course, declarations of conformity don't have an expiry date.
That's correct. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for that.
And then similarly on the last hand side, you can clearly put a CA mark on your product now. There are a number of products which do have CA marks. Not only medical devices, but others. In fact, I saw my pint mug when I was down the pub the other day had a CA mark on it. So there are obviously some industries which are already using CA marking, and that process is open to medical device manufacturers already. So again, that is another one of those routes, again, as we transition through those dates. So I think that sort of tries and sets the scene for where we are with regulatory processes at the moment, but I'm sure that as SMEs sitting on this call, you have some sort of specific questions as to how that relates to your products. Thinking about those milestones on that slide, on that roadmap, but also the way that we're going through MDR and CA marking processes. So with that in mind, Steve and I are here to help. So please fire away, send through any questions that you may have.
Right, you've got your first one, guys. This is Katrina. Hello all, we are a small company, startup, and our device is class 2A. How can we start with the clinical evaluation process? This is an ophthalmic device. Many thanks. Karina. So who wants to go at that? That's probably you, is it, Phil?
Right, so it's important to say, I think, that whatever the classification is, you have to satisfy the essential principles, whether they are, well, at the moment, they are the general safety and performance requirements in the medical device regulation, or in the UK statutory instrument, those are going to be the ones bound to the old medical device directive, because that's what the statutory instrument is based on. But essentially, what you have to do, Katrina, is to look at those essential principles, find the essential principles which relate to you when it comes to clinical work, and then to develop your clinical program accordingly. So it's important, when I was working as a consultant, it was always important, I think, for me to advise companies to first of all identify exactly what you wanted your product to do, your intended purpose, and how you, in fact, you expected your product to achieve that intended purpose. And those are the things that you should focus on when it comes to developing your clinical program. So there are, in fact, two ways that you actually do that. First of all, you can satisfy and demonstrate that performance through clinical investigation or through clinical evaluation, or a mix of both. And the higher the risk of classification in general, this is, you'll be expected to do clinical investigation. So in fact, with a class 3 product, you'd be expected to do a clinical investigation as part of your demonstration of performance. With a class 2A product, you might have a little bit of leeway in that respect, but I guess it really depends on the novelty of your product and how that's actually being presented. But again, think very much about intended purpose and how you expect that intended purpose to be achieved. Try not to deviate away from that or to change your mind when it comes to your intended purpose. As soon as you start changing your intended purpose, you will need to revisit your plan as to what sort of clinical information that you're going to have to start generating. The difference between investigation and evaluation is an important distinction as well. So investigation is what it says on the tin, which means that you really take your product and you start doing work in humans on your product. And that is a sort of, clinical trial as we love and know it. A clinical evaluation, however, could be a review of literature on products of a type, or products which, or the previous derivation of the product which you want to place on the market. So clinical evaluation is not necessarily a human experience, whereas a clinical investigation is. Generally speaking, again, as you sort of develop your product, if you've got like a second iteration of your product, you might want to go down a more of a clinical evaluation route, depending again on how you've developed your product and the significance of any changes that you've made. But generally speaking, as I say, the higher the risk, the greater the burden on clinical evidence. What I'll also say, Andy, if I may, just as a finish to that, don't let the ink go dry on it. And you may hear me say that more than once this afternoon. As you've done your clinical investigations and your evaluations, you've put your CE mark or your CA mark on the product, and you've got it out there and people are using it. Don't let that ink go dry. Always look at your clinical experience post-market and how that's influencing the data which you've already developed. So it's very much a holistic process, is regulation. So don't think of clinical investigations in isolation. I hope that sort of tried to answer that question.
Steve, I noticed you had your hand up for a moment. Is there anything you want to add?
So everything Phil said is set out in the MDR. And there's also an equivalent in the IBDR. So look at the clinical evaluation plan or the performance evaluation plan. It's really important to set these out right from the very beginning. What I see some startup companies who are spending hundreds of thousands of pounds, sometimes millions of pounds, on clinical studies that don't support the intended purpose, that don't support the target population. So you really need to set that performance evaluation plan, that clinical evaluation plan out first. And the other thing about not letting the ink go dry is watch out for state of the art. Your product has to take into account state of the art in technology and state of the art in medicine. State of the art not being the best. State of the art is a regulatory term. There's a marketing term for state of the art, which is the best. State of the art in regulatory term is about what is current practice. So if state of the art in technology moves and you're no longer state of the art, you're kind of old fashioned, you're gonna have to change update your clinical evaluation plan or your performance evaluation plan. If state of the art in medicine changes, if the care pathway changes, if the way in which this is done by physicians in hospitals becomes new, then it could be that your product is no longer state of the art. So watch out for that one as well. You could have all the clinical evidence you need, but if you're not state of the art, it's no good. So, but you can start your planning now. And if you've got an IVD and you're doing your scientific validity, you don't even need a device to start your scientific validity.
That's a really good point. And Steve, I can never remember these numbers, and of course, lots of people say, well, where can I find a sort of a good basis? I always used to find the MedDev Guidance is really helpful in this respect, because they really sort of set things out, don't they? And
Phil, you're so old-fashioned.
I know.
MedDev.
I know.
We don't have MedDev anymore.
I used to find them a really good read because they sort of section things out nicely and that sort of stuff. So
I was joking a bit there, but MedDevs are around the directives you need to look at the MDCG guidance for the regulations. So all of those med devs, hopefully that a lot of that good stuff has been transported across.
Been superseded.
Being transported, the good stuff being transported across, but it's the MDCG guidance which refers to the regulations, to the MDR and IVDR.
So in old money, I think it was MedDev 2.7-1, and there was a fourth revision, revision 4, which dealt with clinical investigations, and that sort of was really good. The other standards that you can use, of course, because there are standards which you can use to define how to set out a clinical investigation. That is standard EN ISO
14155.
14155. That's right.
And
14155.
And 20916 for IVDs.
Right. So those are the ones that you need to look for.
Excellent. That was a comprehensive answer, guys. And it reminded me actually of the webinar. I think it's the classification webinar where you say, look at your intended purpose and plan from there. You've kind of reiterated that. You've reiterated
most
that
definitely. Most definitely.
So if any of it was a bit confusing, you'll find, I think it's the second webinar is on classification, and it will reinforce those points. We've got quite a few questions coming in now, which is good. William said, which notified bodies are currently certified for UKCA and clinical scope? Oh, their clinical scope is a class 3 product, and are these notified bodies taking on new clients? It's something we've picked up in various places. So who wants to go first on that?
Go on, Steve.
So the designated bodies, the approved bodies
in UKCA UK, and class 3 particularly.
They're not called notified bodies in the UK. They're called approved bodies, and there's 3 of them: UL and BSI. I think they have full scope, and then SGS is the third one. They only have one narrow, the very narrow scope, which is just some particular IVDs. So you've effectively only got 2 UKCA mark approved bodies, and they have full scope. They will more than likely be transported across to the new UKCA mark. There are a further, I think, let me think. There's further 8 applicants or potential applicants to be approved bodies in the UK who are at various different stages, either at their final audit, or they're still having their applications assessed, or they're about to put an application into MHRA. If you talk about notified bodies for EU, for MDR and IVDR, I can't remember the exact number, but there's something like 18 or 20 notified bodies for MDR and 7 notified bodies for IVDR. It's nowhere near enough to get through all the certificates that are needed, and there's going to be some real bottlenecks in the EU. But yeah, the question about class 3, they're not designated according to classification. Generally, they're designated according to a notified body code, which is usually around the device rather than the classification. But it's a really good point. Look at the scope of designation first.
The other thing that's important to run alongside that is that from a strategic viewpoint, you also have to think about where you're going to market your product and what you want. So if you want to market your product in Europe, you're going to need to use a European-based notified body. And if you want to just market your product in Great Britain, Scotland, England and Wales, you're going to need to use a UK-based conformity assessment body. And I think that the consultation output from MHRA that we received beginning of week before last actually clearly says that the MHRA have that in their plans to still have UK-based conformity assessment bodies for CA marking. Northern Ireland is slightly different. Northern Ireland being a de facto member state of the European Union, you have options for how you market your product. So generally speaking, you would put a CE mark on it because it is that member state within the European Union. But if all you're going to be doing is placing the product on the UK market, that's England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, then you can have a UK NI mark, I believe, which is slightly different, but would be generated according to the statutory instrument that we have. But it would have to be labelled accordingly, and anything which you do via that route, you couldn't transport across the border into the rest of Europe. So think about Northern Ireland as a potential, but again, geographically, you might want to think about where your conformity assessment body or your notified body is that you use. But it's a buyer's market, right, Steve? So, you know, you sort of look in that respect, you look around and choose the approved body which suits you as a manufacturer best.
So there's a lot of potential notified bodies around who are in the application process. You need to have a really honest conversation with them about where they are in that process and how long it's going to take, whether they are going to be designated for the full scope. What you don't want to be is stuck with a notified body who doesn't get designated, because then you're going to have to scrabble around at the last minute and change your notified body.
And then the other question is, are those assessment bodies in the UK taking on new clients? That is a really good question. I do know, having spoken to one of the candidate bodies that wants to come into the UK to work, has said that in all honesty, all they're going to be able to do is transfer their current client base to CA marking. So they're not really going to be accepting new people onto their list. But I suspect that, as Steve says, the UK bodies such as BSI, SGS and UL will be, because that's where their business is. So we'll see how that goes. But the whole system, whether it's in the UK or Europe in general, is struggling for capacity. So you really do have to speak to that approved body at an early stage, make sure that they're aware of what your timings are and what your intent is. So again, make sure you have that discussion early.
Any idea how long before launch you would give as far as advice is concerned?
You warned me at the beginning of this webinar that I shouldn't use words such as depends, but it does depend on what your classification of your product is, because the development times are that much different. So if you've got, as we did with Katrina's question, maybe a 2A product, your development time for that 2A product might be down to around 12-18 months. So in which case I would get in touch with the conformity assessment body almost as soon as you start developing your product. Yeah. But if it's a class 3 where you're looking at placing your product on the market maybe in 3 or 4 years time, it may be worth sort of speaking to them in 18 months, 2 years time.
Okay.
So the recommendation from the European Commission, which I think is still a bit risky, is that you need to approach, if you've got an existing product, if you're not talking about new products, if you're talking about existing products, is that you should be approaching your notified body at least 12 months before the expiry of your current certificate. And I think that's risky. I think you should be talking to your notified body 18 to 24 months before the expiry of your certificate, because otherwise you'll be put in a queue. Your application may not be considered complete, and also notified bodies are giving dates depending on the availability of assessors. So if you have an assessor who's got the code for your device, depending on the device, if there's a multitude of assessors for that device, you might be lucky. If there's not enough assessors for that device, you may be talking about at least 18 months from having your completed application accepted by a notified body right through to getting that certificate to place it on the market.
I think the message is start early, whatever you're doing, isn't it? Particularly because there's a shortage of capacity, and whilst the designations are unclear or new players coming into the market, it's still got to happen, and you need to be you don't want to be under the restrictions that weren't of your making. That's the important thing, isn't it? So talk to people early, engage with them early, because it does seem to take a long time, certainly from personal experience.
So I spoke to a manufacturer whose MDD certificate runs out in September. They started discussions with the notified bodies back in April 2020, in plenty of time.
Yeah.
But now they're just a few months away from the end of their certificate expiry. They haven't even got a date for audit. They've had their technical file, their application accepted as complete by the notified body, which is rare. But they still haven't got a date for audit. So they're facing the scenario of, in September, when they don't have a certificate, they're going to have to take their products off the market until they get recertified. That's
not a new situation, is it? That's been going on for some time. It's disappointing to see it's continuing, but the word is talk as early as possible, before you even get your pen out for the ink to dry, Phil.
Quite right.
Yeah. Right. Okay, we're doing well here. We've got a few questions here. Is it possible to update your intended use post CE mark, or do you need to reapply, i.e., can you start with a narrow use and broaden it? I think which kind of goes back to the previous question, but there's a very practical point in there.
It is, and absolutely you can. And that's, in many ways, you can use your post-market surveillance processes to enable you to do that. You know, if you do have that narrow scope, that narrow intended use, you can always extend that out as you get more experience of using the product. But again, you have to remember how that is affecting your CE mark. Your technical file will reflect your intended purpose, right? So if your technical file is for, I don't know, let's use a surgical instrument as an example. If you're just using your surgical instrument as a pin pricker or something for an allergy test or something like that, you may have your technical file built to that. But then when you realize using it, actually there's a really good reason why I can use this to maybe use it on a different part of the body or in a different surgical environment or whatever. As soon as you get that far, you could be changing, first of all, the classification of your product, but also by changing the intended purpose of the product, you could be then looking at, well, how do I demonstrate the performance of that device in that particular setting? It's not only sort of restricted to that. Another really good example was I worked for a company once that manufactured infusion pumps, and the intent was to only use those infusion pumps in a hospital setting. Okay, so that's what the technical file was built for. But then experience post-market showed that, in fact, well, why don't we try and use this in a home setting? And of course, that has completely different demands on that product than it does in the hospital setting. For example, you know, you could be using, that product could be used by my mum, who's sitting there watching doctors in the afternoon, you know, and she's got very clumsy fingers. She may not necessarily understand what she's reading on the readout, and so on and so on. So you've really then got to look at how you extend that clinical performance, how you assess risk as part of that. That's another one of those things was on that roadmap. Don't forget, right at the beginning, is that as you continually do this, you're continually assessing the risk against the patient and what that means for the data that you're having to produce to satisfy those essential principles. So yes, by all means, sort of use that as an excuse to extend indications.
So you can use post-market clinical follow-up or post-market performance follow-up to get more data to support your current intended use. But once you start changing your intended use, that might be considered a significant change. Changing the design or intended purpose could be considered a significant change, which means that your notified body might want to recertify.
I was going to say that's where you would talk to your notified body and gain their advice, wouldn't you?
Well, they may be able to advise you. They may want you to simply apply or not apply. If you do need to recertify, you'll need to present all the evidence that supports that new intended purpose. And for medical devices, you're just required to write down the intended purpose. For an IVD, there are 8 separate elements to intended purpose that you need to include in your instructions for use and your technical file. And if you change just one of those elements, that might be considered a significant change to the intended use. So really kind of watch out for that. The European Union does not have a very good framework for innovation. So things like changes to intended purpose, bringing in new devices, it's not always a friendly place to be, because the European Union is really concerned about keeping products on the market rather than bringing new products to market or extending intended or making significant changes to products. So have a think about that. That should be part of your decision making about where you're going to launch product and how you're going to get your clinical evidence post-market.
Okay. Actually, the difference between significant and insignificant change is a really good one, isn't it? And there are very few documents out there which give you that decision-making process to allow you to do that. Although there was one, I think, which was written in Europe some time ago. I don't know whether it's still current, Steve. But the companies
there is MDCG guidance on legacy devices, where significant changes there, and both for MDR and for IVDR, 2 separate MDCG guidance documents. Interesting.
So in fact, with an insignificant change, what you could potentially do, and I don't know how risky this is now, it was something that we used to do when I was working in industry anyway. For an insignificant change, you can write that into your quality management system, which is then assessed by the conformity assessment body or the notified body during their review cycles and all of that sort of stuff. Whereas those significant changes, as Steve suggests, may have to go back through that review cycle immediately with the conformity assessment body. But it's in many ways it's a sort of a subjective thing. Sometimes there's invariably sort of grey areas where you think, is this significant, is this not significant? Even on software, I remember sort of there being some notified body variances in what they consider as significant. So at one time I know that the Irish notified body considered any change to software, minor or major changes, needed to go through their review systems. So yeah, I think there are ways of handling change, and again, it's one of those key processes that you need in your quality system.
Great. Okay, thanks, guys. Right, another one here. We've got a good number of questions coming in. From the research we have done, we understand that under the MDR, it is much harder to claim equivalence. It kind of follows on a little bit, doesn't it? We have particular concerns around needing full access to the technical file of any items for which we are claiming equivalence. Can any item or items of equivalence be claimed against a medical device which is currently certified against the MDD and where full access to the technical file is not possible?
Equivalence is one of those things which was discussed at an early stage when we were sort of working on the MDR. There was always skepticism, I think, by the regulator as to companies who would, I'm loath to say abuse the process, but to actually sort of say, oh, well, our product is the same as Joe Bloggs is down the road, you know, so I'm going to claim equivalence to that without actually then demonstrating clearly the compliance against the essential principles. The first thing to say, and the most important thing to say, is, again, going back to the first question, irrespective of classification, you have to, in your technical file, demonstrate clinical performance. Okay, that is a given. And that is the primary focus of those safety and performance requirements. Equivalence was always a thorny issue because it was felt, and I absolutely understand this argument, it was felt that if I'm producing a hip implant as Phil Brown Incorporated, and I see that Andy Davidson Incorporated is producing something that's very similar, it's made of the same material, but it's a slightly different shape, and you know, I'm using it for the over 60s, whereas you want to use yours in active athletes or whatever it is. It's almost impossible for me to claim equivalence. And the regulations as they're set up in the MDR quite clearly say you can't do that. You can claim equivalence if you can show that the product that you're claiming equivalence to is effectively identical to the one that you're wanting to try and CE mark. That implies that you have to have that relationship with the original equipment manufacturer to say, well, my product is made of cobalt chrome and it's got 5% of chrome in it, blah, 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 blah. It's made of this tolerance. It's made with these machines. It's got this sort of densities, all of those sorts of things. So that's the only way that you can claim equivalence. That's not the same as in the US, and this just again shows you some of the different jurisdictional differences. In the US, where you've got a 510K system, it's very much based on that sort of predication against previous products and that sort of stuff. But unfortunately, the CE marking process has reduced the ability to claim equivalence to practically zero. So you really do have to demonstrate that performance. Steve, is that roughly right in your mind?
Yeah. So in MDR defines equivalence around technical, clinical, biological factors. So you've got to be able to demonstrate it along those lines. I agree that you might be able to claim equivalence with version 1 of your device, between version 1 and version 2 of your device. You might be able to do that.
Yes.
But from another manufacturer, no. You also have to have access to all of their technical documentation if you're claiming equivalence, which you're unlikely to get from a competitor. So claiming equivalence with a competitor is just not going to happen. The most egregious example of this one that I can think of is where some manufacturers were producing mesh for incontinence and products to help prevent incontinence products, where we're using that for we're using data from a hernia mesh as equivalent. And of course, you know, incontinence and pelvic organ prolapse are very different to hernia, and a very, very different intended use, even if the materials were the same. So people who used that to claim equivalence, it was particularly problematic. And I think that experience from competent authorities across Europe and the UK has put people right off the idea of equivalence. I suspect the UK will be even more strict about equivalence than the EU. It also means that what you called OEM, Phil, original equipment manufacturing, what we now call virtual manufacturing, will be really, really difficult to do unless you've got full access to that file, to that technical file, not including all of the proprietary information, because the notified body will want to see it there and then during the audit, rather than having to go to somebody else to get that information. So equivalence, yeah, you're right, Phil. It's just not going to happen. Interestingly, in IBDR, the concept of equivalence is there, but it's not defined, and it's going to be, although it's possible to use equivalence for an IVD medical device, I don't think anybody's going to be able to do it because it's just simply not defined the way it is in MDR.
And just to clarify that completely, that wouldn't vary by classification of device.
No,
not at all.
No, although Steve did raise a really good point there about you know, if you want to claim equivalence within your own product portfolio, then that may be an easier process, because if you're just going from version 1 to version 2, you can potentially use some of the data which you used for version 1 to support version 2. But again, that's because you as the manufacturer have access to all of that technical data in the first instance.
Of course, yeah. Before we move on to the next question, it's worth mentioning Steve's kindly put up the MDCG guidance that he was referring to earlier. So there's a link in the chat if anyone wants to take that down. Right, next question. For Majid, we are a startup company. Our app, so we're getting into the digital space now, is to detect heart disease. Does the mobile app require the CE mark? How long's a piece of string on this one, guys?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, please
do. So the detection of heart disease is a medical purpose. An app which is intended to detect heart disease is therefore a medical device. I'm assuming it's not an IVD. Because presumably you're just looking at heart rhythms and not taking a sample to look at troponin or another kind of marker. Yes, it needs a CE mark. Yes, it needs to comply with all of the requirements of the medical device regulation. If you want to say it's not a medical device, then don't make a claim for detecting heart disease. Or even saying it will detect arrhythmias, or even saying it will give you peace of mind that your heart is operating normally. All of these things will tend to make a medical claim. But if it's just measuring heartbeat rather than ECG function or heart function, then your normal Fitbit or whatever kind of smartwatch you use is not. But all of the if you look at the Apple products which detect they're basically a mini ECG, and they're detecting arrhythmias and VF. They are all CE marked as medical devices.
So, right, the Apple products are the Apple Watch, for instance.
The Apple Watch and the app that goes with it.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Phil, do you want to add anything to that, or
only that it reiterates from right the first sort of conversations we were having, to make sure you identify your indications and your intended purpose of your product right from the beginning, because that will really determine what you need to develop from a technical perspective. It can even depend, as Steve says, whether you're in or out the scope of the regulation.
Okay, good, thanks. Next question. What level of clinical evaluation is required for class, I think it's 1R devices? Does that make sense?
Yeah, reusables.
Right, class 1R, got you. Yeah. Would this section require an author with the respective qualifications to complete the report of the clinical evaluation, obviously?
I'll answer the first bit first. The second bit first. I think in that the author just has to be an expert in the products which you're supporting. So you could use a nurse, you could use a theatre nurse. If you've got a reusable surgical instrument, it could be a clinician. It could be anybody, really. I think. Yeah. I think probably the higher up you go in classification, though, the more objective you'd want your evaluation report to be. So it might be in that instance that you might be sort of looking at having some sort of medical input, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a medic.
So where would you start your medical input if you went as far as it would be as low as 2A?
Sorry, Andy, it depends. It
had to happen.
Yeah, I know. So it really would sort of depend. I mean, if you're one of the guys on the call who's you've got 6 people in your company, you may not necessarily have that medical input, but you may have somebody who's developing that product with you who is a nurse in a hospital who routinely uses these particular products, who would be able to give much more of an overview as to whether or not the clinical data that's being presented is appropriate or not. So it really does depend on how you're using that product.
Right.
Just to be pedantic, I believe the clinical evaluation report, performance evaluation report, doesn't need to be signed. It's the clinical performance study report or the clinical investigation report which needs to be signed. And the evaluation report will need to have a qualified assessment that it meets the benefit risks. So exactly what you were saying, Phil, that qualification to make that qualified assessment does not necessarily have to be a qualified medic. It could be somebody. It will be somebody who is qualified enough to understand the benefits and risks of that device.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's go back to the first part then, Andy, which was what would you need to clinically support your 1R product? For those who are on the call, the difference we now have as a result of the MDR, 4 distinct classifications within class 1. There's your ones which are measuring, have a measuring function. You have class 1 products which are sterile, and you have class 1 products which are reusable. And then you have your other class 1 products, which might be your hospital beds or your orthopedic footwear or whatever. So when it comes to reuse, the best example I can give you is one of our members who works with surgical instruments. Now, of course, the scalpel blade that they would attach to a handle is sterile, single use, right?
Yep.
So that's something different, and that's a sort of one of those sort of throwaway sort of things. So that has its own classification. The handle, however, might be used hundreds of times. And I remember going to a sterilization facility with this particular company, and we were talking about how to demonstrate performance of this handle now that it becomes a reusable product. And they looked at this whole tray of scalpel blades that have gone through cleaning, and they said, wow, we haven't manufactured these handles for 20 years. And I said, well, how do you know that? And they said, well, we stopped etching our name on these handle blades back in 1998 or whatever it was. So we know that it's at least that old. So I said to them, well, surely this then is an ideal opportunity for you to look back at how easy it is to use that handle blade. At the end of the day, that handle has to accept the blade which goes on it without the blade sort of wobbling around and sort of, and you will have a specification for that handle, right? So the important thing will be to run that scalpel blade either 100 times through a cleaning cycle, and you could contract with a company to do that for you, or you could just take that blade, that handle, which you know had been in there for 20 years, and say, well, does that still meet specification? Can I take this away from me? I just want to sort of see if it meets specification. If it does, you've got the ability to then say, well, in that particular instance, we could claim that these handles are going to be within limits and within the CE marking of that class 1R for 20 years, or for, we'll call it 10 years before we have to replace them. And then we know we've got a good comfort factor around it. So you just got to be clever in the way that you start to think about how your product is going to be used and how you can demonstrate that use. I hope that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. And you've got a great source of post-market data there, haven't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Can I jump in with a question for Phil?
Absolutely.
Certainly, yeah.
This? So for class 1 reusable, class 1 measuring, class 1 sterile, is it true that the notified body is only going to look at in the file? They're only going to look at those aspects about the reusability, measurement, and sterility.
Yes, absolutely. At least that's what they're supposed to be looking at, Steve. So yes, they're going to be interested in looking at that reusable part of your technical file. But of course, as a reviewer of that technical file, they will say, if you're looking at the sterilization bit or a sterile product, they might say, okay, so how can this product be sterilized 10 times? Show me the evidence that it can be sterilized 10 times. What processes are you using to sterilize it 10 times? Who are you asking to do that? What tolerances are they putting on that sterilization process? So although they're sort of looking at that, they may extend their researches into other areas of your quality management system unknowingly, or sort of without thinking about it. Yeah, without intent. So you've got to keep on top of that. But essentially, yes, they're only going to be interested in that reusable section of your technical file. Does
that come from the fact that the MDR, a lot of those sorts of devices were self-certification, and now they've got classification as reusable? So they're going to look specifically into that area.
Yeah, and self-certification is always one of those areas which is a contentious area for the regulator, even more so with IVD, Steve. Yes.
I mean, the introduction of these concepts of measurability and reusability into the MDR, because they weren't in the MDD, that's another reason why it's just taking up a lot of notified body capacity.
Yeah.
The Class A sterile IVDs would need to go through a notified body, but there's no such thing as, well, the Class A IVDs will all have some kind of measuring function. That's standard. You know, an equipment will measure a fluid. And you don't really get reusability as an IVD concept. So it's only the Class A sterile.
Yeah, I mean, just as an aside, Andy, I remember speaking to some of Steve's ex-colleagues at MHRA around vigilance and classification, and you know that it was a really good question about what clinical evidence do we need, and of course it's easy to think, oh, it's a low risk product, I don't have to do very much. But in fact, the MHRA probably still does receive more vigilance cases with Class 1 products than any other. So whether that's a volume thing or whether that is because people just think that they don't have to do that level of work for a Class 1, I don't know, but it's really important to say that CE mark and the satisfaction of those general safety and performance requirements, even for the Class 1 reusable products, applies to everything. And you have to have best practice, and legal practice is that you comply with all of those and have all of that data available before you sign that declaration of conformity.
Got you. Yeah, I appreciate that. Right, let's move on now. Back on software by the looks of things. Is there any advice you could provide a small medtech startup to safely expedite our products to market? In our case, we're a software as a medical device manufacturer using AI technology. It's a fairly wide question.
Wow.
Read the roadmap.
Wow.
Would be a good place to start.
Yeah.
Start early, get your classification right. I mean, we've kind of covered some of these things, haven't you?
Yeah, and of course, as it stands at the moment, as Steve said earlier on, if you're in scope of the regulation, then you still have to go through and satisfy all of those relevant general safety and performance requirements. So look at that, look at the roadmap that you have to actually produce to do that. It's just that the questions will be different, I suspect, with software. I'm not a software expert, and I know Steve is probably closer to software than I am, but yeah, the requirements are still the same, I think.
So I would think seriously about whether you want to be in the UK or in the EU, because the UK classification rules currently, most software is going to be Class 1, non-sterile, non-reusable, non-measuring. So it's self-declaration. In the EU, if it's MDR, then they're probably likely to be Class 2A or even 2B. If your IVDs, it will also be one of the higher classifications as well, C or B. That's because the classification rules are different. MDCG have issued some really good guidance on software classification and the clinical evidence that's required for software. You know, if you understand IVDs and you understand concepts such as analytical performance, clinical performance, and scientific validity, then those concepts apply equally across to software under MDR according to the MDCG guidance. So although that's not written into the regulations, the MDCG guidance does cover that. But again, if you want to, if you want to just keep to the UK and use current UK MDR and get your declaration in there before June 23, then you'd still have to have all that clinical data, but it just wouldn't be assessed by a notified body or an approved body as yet. But it's inevitable that all of those will be a higher classification at some point.
Is it fair to say that the software regulation is sort of a developing in real time set of regulations? I mean, it's good to hear that you say it's mirroring a lot of the IVD or IVDR in terms of where it's headed, but it's certainly from the round table activities, we've some of this seems to be quite split and different, even within the UK countries. Things like DTAC and NHSE coming up with some part of their regulation, and other people sort of saying, well, we don't really follow that just yet. And it almost gets down to individual hospitals.
I mean, it depends on who's developing it, whether it's being developed in-house or being developed commercially. I'm guessing this one is commercial. And the requirements are fairly clear. The difficulty is for things like AI. It is developing, and you've got the AI Act in the EU to watch out for. There isn't an AI Act in the UK. MHRA have told us they're going to embark on a I can't remember what the word is, but they're going to be looking at a work program around regulation of software in the UK. They've rejected a lot of the more difficult and complex ideas, such as the airlock classification system. They've banked that one, but they are looking at how they're going to enable predetermined change control plans, PCCPs, where you're going to go through significant change. Actually, you don't have to go through a notified body process every time, like we talked before with the intended use changing. Yeah. If you go through a significant change for a piece of AI or a piece of software, then you can just have that change control plan in place as being predetermined, and then it's okay not to have to go through that notified body process time and time again. But again, it's only guidance rather than legislation. So it'll be interesting to see how the notified bodies and competent authorities actually deal with that. You
mentioned UK and you mentioned Europe, and almost said avoid these at the minute. What about the US?
They did. Well, first of all, Andy, I mentioned UK and EU.
Sorry, UK and EU. Sorry.
As far as I'm concerned, UK is still in Europe. My geography lesson isn't that old-fashioned.
Fair point.
But in terms of the US, I believe they did embark on something around predetermined change control as a pilot, but I'm not sure where that's got to yet, whether that's kind of enacted. The US is great on innovation of regulation, but it takes a long time for them that to be put into the legislation.
Right. Okay.
I think I'm right as well, only because it's sitting here on my desktop and I'm reading through it at the moment. That the consultation response that the MHRA pushed out a couple of weeks back actually talked about using and globalizing the definitions in the UK. So actually sort of looking much more broadly as to what the definitions of software was in that respect. So it'd be interesting to see in the future, and there was a huge swathe of text in that consultation response which talked about producing guidance and sort of working on innovation, particularly in software areas. So it is a dynamic area in the UK for sure, and it'll be interesting to sort of keep a little finger on that pulse as it sort of moves forward in the next sort of couple of years. For sure, the UK wants to be ahead of the curve on those sorts of innovative programs, and it includes this sort of sandboxing ideas and all of that sort of stuff as well. And so it'll be interesting to see what comes out from the next step of that consultation.
Okay,
Yeah, that won't be in the regs, Phil. None of that will be in the regs.
No, it'll be guidance, won't it, more than regulation?
Maybe. I'm not even sure that they'll publish guidance on it. I think they're going to have a long, hard think about software regulation in the UK.
So you think this could be several years out, just for starters? Yeah. Okay. Next question. Can you place CE and UKCA marks on one product to cover both UK and EU markets?
Yeah, so that you can have that dual labelling. The Commission has told us that they will accept UKCA mark alongside CE, but of course only the CE will be recognised in the EU, whereas the UK might recognise both UKCA and in certain circumstances CE as well.
Okay. Here's one, quite a long question this, but let's see where we get to. This is from Alan. There are a number of products on the market from various manufacturers which are applied to the skin for cooling for alleviation of migraine. These include menthol, which when absorbed by the skin has a medicinal effect on the nerves, enhancing the cooling effect. What comments do you have regarding classification of these simple devices, considering Rule 14? All devices incorporating as an integral part a substance which, if used separately, can be considered to be a medicinal product, and that has an action ancillary to that of the device, are classified as Class 3. Nice complex one. Who wants to have a crack at that?
So I'm not going to answer about menthol specifically. I'll come back to that in a moment. But if it incorporates, even if it's a really simple device, if it incorporates a medicinal substance, then it goes straight up to Class 3, and it requires that Medicines Authority approval. The question is the next question, therefore, is menthol a medicinal substance? The question states that, so I'm guessing that they know, and it is. But I would want to verify that through the Manual of Borderline Decisions. Again, that's a directives document, and it won't. I don't believe it'll be updated for the regulations, but it will give you an idea around what is considered a medicinal substance and what isn't. And if you're not sure, then I would write to your competent authority and ask them, because what has a metabolic or immunological process is very complicated.
Okay.
Absolutely. I remember when I worked for a company that manufactured first aid plasters, Class 2As. You know, you'd think they're quite easy. You put silver into the pad, or chlorhexidine into the pad as an antibiotic, Class 3.
Yeah.
You know, without question.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so it's Class 3 plus pharmaceutical registration as well, I guess, is it?
Very few companies will put new chemical entities into those sorts of devices. They're normally fairly well used, well characterized materials, which can be perhaps approved through the medicines group through sort of expedited processes of looking at technical files. And I can't remember the name of the files that are used, actually, Steve. But
expedited is a misnomer.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, there are a few companies that will say, I've got this brand new chemical entity and I want to incorporate it into my medical device. And say, well, why do you want to do that? I mean, that's the first thing you have to answer is, okay, you want to put a medicament in this product. Why? What advantage does it give you placing this medicament into a product? So, you know, there are lots of things, and that borderline issue is really interesting. Again, thinking about that menthol question, you could argue that maybe that pad is there to deliver menthol, or is it just a pad which happens to have menthol in it? Do you see what I mean? There's a distinct difference. If you've got one, you could be looking at medicines approval. If you're looking at another, you're looking at devices approval. It really just depends on how you're pitching your product and how you're presenting it.
Fair enough. Steve, did you want to comment any more on menthol? No, okay, fair enough. What's rule for the uninitiated? What's Rule 14?
You read it out.
Oh, that is Rule 14.
You did.
Right. Sorry. Okay. It was me reading the punctuation. Well, there we go. That's handy, isn't it? Right, ML comes up with one here. Referring to the latest announcement on the new UKCA transitional measures, if we rely on the EU certification completed with an EU notified body before the end of 2022, we've got dates in here, chaps, there is no need to recertify the product with a UK approved body until the EU certificates expires on the 31st of December 2027, whichever is soonest. In a case where we deposited a file with the EU notified body, can you reconfirm that there is no need to deposit the same file with a UK approved body? We just need to refer to the EU certificates, EU deposit number and EU notified body name number on the UK DOC, and affix the UKCA mark along the CE mark. Thank you. Yeah, that's a nice complex question. You might want to read that. You might want to read that on the questions.
Absolutely not going to confirm that. Definitely not going to confirm that for two reasons. One, I don't think we're able to give individual advice, and I would caveat anything here to say that this is the best available knowledge. But the second one is that the MHRA response, the 155 pages, is their plans for legislation. It is not legislation. Until it's written into the legislation, June 23 is the deadline. That's not to say that it's unlikely to happen. I think it's very likely to happen, but it's got to go through a parliamentary process to get written into, to get put into statute books. And until then, it's not the law.
The other thing to add is that if you've got your CE mark, the current standstill is that if you've got a CE mark, you can place the product on the UK market. That transition period is going to allow for an appropriate transition through that, hopefully, as Steve says, when that's written into the law. But the important adjunct to that is that you can't place your product on that UK market then unless you've registered your product with the MHRA. So it's a dual process. So if you've got your CE mark, you still have to register your product on the MHRA's database. So, and that will include details of your certification and all that sort of stuff.
But I would confirm that, to the best of my knowledge, that what was set out in the question is within the MHRA plans. Right.
Hopefully that's a reasonable answer. Amal, if you want to come back on that, perhaps drop us another note. Another question here. What are the considerations for performance and clinical evaluation for a urine testing IVD that could be used in a GP, hospital or pharmacy? So,
do you want to start with that one, Phil?
Or pharmacy. IVD.
I think that's your area of expertise, Steve.
Yeah, I thought IVD was your area, Steve.
He's just testing me.
Yeah.
So is it looks like it's possibly a near patient test, I guess. So you
GP, hospital or pharmacy. So it could be, yeah, couldn't it?
Yeah. I think it's unlikely to be a self-test, and it's clearly not a lab test. So there are requirements around conformity assessment for near patient tests, what we used to call point of care tests. In terms of the clinical evaluation, I think the analytical performance and scientific validity are fairly straightforward. I think the clinical evaluation, you really need to have that in context. So it needs to be able to support that it can be used in a GP or hospital or pharmacy. Look at what might change. If it's something that requires the device to be very level, then how often do things tip over in GPs and pharmacies? So have you got the evidence that actually it stays level and gives you the right result in those environments? But it may be that your clinical evaluation covers all of those different characteristics of those environments, which might affect the performance. So you just need to justify that your clinical evaluation covers that in context use.
Great, thank you. Phil, you got anything to add there, since you don't know about IVDs? Allegedly?
Steve's your man.
Yeah,
Steve's your man.
We'll get you trained up yet, Phil.
Yeah. Work in progress, eh? Work in progress. Right, last question we've got at the moment. So we've only got last 15 minutes. So if anyone's got any more questions, please raise them. We do have one on email that was sent earlier, which we'll come to in a moment. So can you claim equivalence with one of the intended uses of your device and use a predicate, which we mentioned predicates before, then provide CEP for the other intended uses?
Well, the same arguments around claiming equivalence exist, as we've discussed before.
Yeah.
But you'd need to have all of the relevant detail from the manufacturer of the predicate device to demonstrate, as Steve says, your biological, physical, and clinical performance, technical data of your product. You can claim, if you are claiming that, and then you want to extend the indication. Was that the question, Andy?
Looks like it. Yeah. Hang on, just a second. I'm just where's me? I've lost me chat now. Oh, there we are. Right. You can claim equivalence with one of the intended uses of your device. Use a predicate, then provide CEP for the other intended uses. So it's equivalence with one.
I would suspect.
And then provide CEP,
yes.
clinical evaluation, I guess, for the.
Yeah, I would. You'd have to be very clever in the way that you write your technical file, because your technical file, of course, includes all of your quality, safety, and performance data, and is a demonstration of compliance with those general safety and performance requirements for your product. So if you have the relevant quality and safety data for the predicate, you can then satisfy the clinical GSPRs to extend your product onwards, I would suspect. But of course, that means that you then have to sort of look very carefully as to whether or not you're extending your product into an area where you need to redo some of your safety work, or whether or not your quality controls are adequate. So it would be a holistic view as to whether or not you could do that. You can't just simply say, well, okay, I'm going to use this predicate device and then sort of do it. But you've still, because you are the legal manufacturer for that product, you still have to be liable for that quality, safety, and performance of that product, irrespective of whether you're making it or not. You could, I guess, if you are using that predicate device, maybe you're even licensing it from the original manufacturer. What you could do is to have enough contracts or robustness in those contracts to enable you to demonstrate or to even subcontract compliance with those sections of the GSPRs to that original manufacturer, and then have the performance data to support the new indication. But you'd have to have that explained very, very carefully in technical work. Okay. Again, don't forget, it's the conformity assessment body that you're convincing. So you've got to make sure that that technical information is right first time, and the with the capacity as it is within the conformity assessment bodies, it's the advice even more so now is to make sure that you try and get that technical information right first time, and not wait for the conformity assessment body to say, I'm going to give you a non-conformity for this bit, and then try and mop up those little bits, because the conformity assessment body is not going to like you for that. So you're really going to want to try and satisfy all those things as upfront as you can.
Yeah. Okay. A fast flurry of final questions here. Once a medical device has received CE certification, is there any regulatory guidance for EU national provisions with respect to device registrations or notifications and relevant fees? Also acceptable languages for device labels and IFUs. We're now working in, I know Steve's still in Europe, but we're now working with 27 different countries outside the UK. So there's a good one. Do you want to have a crack at that, Steve? First off?
Yeah, I mean, the last one first, the language requirements. Yeah, you're going to have to look at what the national competent authority requests. Some products can be, things for self-testing obviously need to be in the national language. The rest of it can be in English, but some people also ask for that to be in the national language, depending on who the user is. In terms of registration, UDAMED is there. It's available and use it. Not everything is there at the moment. I think it's only actor registration, device registration, and I think the notified body certificates are starting to come on board. But until UDAMED is fully functional, it's not mandatory to use UDAMED, and therefore, you don't have to use it. When it is mandatory, you still might be required to register with national competent authorities as well, and which is going to be quite complex unless the Commission starts requesting that competent authorities match the requests between UDAMED and the competent authority. Some competent authorities will ask the same questions that UDAMED asks, plus a few more, and that makes life incredibly complicated for you.
We used to rely quite a lot on the distributors in country to sort of feed us back a lot of that information. So, if, for example, you're working and you want to sell your product in Spain and you've got a distributor in Spain, they will be able to sort of look on the National Competent Authority website and give you chapter and verse as to what you need to do. Even more so now, I think, with the regulations such there is greater control over economic operators and their responsibilities within that supply chain, you'd be best to work with them to give you that advice, I would have thought.
Fees vary widely. You have initial registration fees, which are generally fairly modest, but then you'd also need to pay for any certificates of free sale that come from that registration. And some competent authorities would charge you for maintenance of the database. I know HPRA in Ireland charge I think it's €100 for initial registration and then €1,000 for annual maintenance. So it can get quite steep.
Okay.
The other thing that might be impacting on a national basis are potentially some of these sustainability questions, like recycling and that sort of stuff. So in Scandinavia, they have fairly strong sort of requirements for that, which might be nationally based. So again, you just got to look out for those and trust your distributors.
Yeah, good point. Good point, that Phil. Right, we've got a few more minutes left. In your opinion, is it better to register a Class 1 accessory device along with a Class 3 device, of which it is an integral part, or alternatively register the Class 1 device separately? It's obviously designed to work together. So
if you put them together as one product, you can any problem with the Class 1 device and needs a recall, you may then therefore need to recall the Class 3 device as well if it's all one product. Yeah. And of course the classification would be the higher classification. Yeah. Packaging them separately is I think is generally quite a good idea because of the opportunity for field safety corrective actions. In terms of registration, I can't see any advantage or disadvantage of registering them separately or together. They're going to be different GMDN codes, different EMDN codes. So if you do them in one registration, you pay one fee. If you do them in separate registrations, you pay separate fees. But you'd be paying more for a more complicated Class 3 device by the sound of things. I didn't know people were charging by class, but I haven't seen that. But of course, as you say, there's 27 competent authorities in the EU. They may all have different ideas. Yeah. Here we go.
I was going to say, Andy, the other really interesting thing there is depends on your strategy, doesn't it? If I think back to that infusion pump example, that particular company used to make a lot of money out of the consumables that are used with that product, and they were registered and classified and CE marked separately to the actual infusion pump for that very reason. Yeah.
I think we may have covered this earlier on, but just, I think, Steve, you've already talked about not making recommendations, but which notified bodies are taking on new clients for CE marking? who would you recommend new companies to contact? I think the second part's a hard one. It's who you can get hold of, probably. It's a simple answer. But I think you covered some of this related to UKCA. And you said, I think, Steve, you said there were about 11, was it?
There might be up to 11.
Up to 11 for CE
UK.
marking, and
CE
IBD
marking
was about 7.
Yeah, there's a few more in Europe.
Right. Do you want to just go on the point and see, just rather than me try and summarise what you said before?
I'll give you, if I give you my opinion, Steve, I'll set myself up, Steve, and then you can shoot me down, right?
I won't. You know this inside out, Phil.
Well, I don't know that so much. Remember that you, as the manufacturer, have the choice as to which notified body you work with in Europe. But what you have to make sure of, as we said earlier on, is that notified body has your product codes within its scope to review. So you can find all of that information on, I think it's the Nando database, or it used to be the Nando database.
Which will give you that,
yeah, which will give you a list of all of the notified bodies which you can use against the regulation and their scopes. Do you know, as to which one you choose, I must admit, I don't have the information to say whether or not they're accepting new clients or whatever. Some probably have got more capacity than others, for sure. But I honestly think that you should look through that list and then do your due diligence as to which notified body you want to work with. Sometimes there are cultural reasons why you would go with a particular notified body, geographic reasons as to why you would go with a particular notified body, or even, dare I say, financial reasons as why you would go to a particular notified body. But capacity, I think, is probably the major one at the moment as to whether or not you would choose A over B. So really sort of look to see which one you want to work with, and then sort of do your due diligence by speaking to them and working with them that way. Again, language might be another one of those reasons. You know, it's easier if we speak English. I know a lot of those notified bodies will speak English, but it might be easier speaking English to a Dutch notified body than it will be speaking to a Romanian one. And that's no disrespect to the Romanian notified bodies. But you get my point, I think.
Right, final 2 questions I think we've got time for at the moment. Hi, can I please check whether a clinical investigation involving a custom-made device will always trigger formal MHRA notification procedures?
Ooh, custom-made.
I
don't know. I'm going to think about that one. That's a really good question.
It is. So we'll have to follow up with that one, won't we?
I will follow up with that one.
And then the final one I think we've got time for now. The emailed question we had before, Giles put in, I have said we'll answer that offline because it was quite long and complicated. You know, the one that John sent us earlier on? I think we can owe him a reply, but it's probably better to take offline. But the results might be quite interesting to add when John circulates the notes in terms of the principles that he covered. So final one here. Please could you expand on the difficulty to virtual manufacture under MDR? Steve, I think you use the term virtual manufacturer, so I think you should start this one.
Yeah, and it depends on which competent authority, it depends on which notified body, it depends on whether you're self-declared or not. So it's not fully consistent. But as I understand it, a notified body will want to see the full technical file if you're virtually manufacturing a product. So if you're self-declared, there's no notified body looking at the technical file, then you don't have, there's nobody telling you have to have the full technical file. But if the notified body wants it, they will want to see the full technical file. If you read the MHRA advice on virtual manufacturing, they say it's okay not to have the full technical file, so long as any proprietary information that the original equipment manufacturer wants to keep to themselves and not share is available on request. I think notified bodies don't really like that because they want to see it there in front of them. And I think other competent authorities want their notified bodies to see the full technical file on site during the audit.
So the
that's why
competent authority can see it, but not necessarily the assessment body, the notified body.
No, the assessment body needs to be a contract between the virtual manufacturer and the original equipment manufacturer that says that the notified body can have access to proprietary information. But as I say, in the EU, that's less accepted. In the UK, the advice from MHRA is that. But if the notified bodies are the gatekeepers of this, advice from MHRA is not going to hold any water.
Good, thank you. Thank you, guys. I think we've covered a lot of ground there. And I appreciate all the questions that we've had from those who've been on the webinar. We still have 43 people on the program, or just starting to drop now. One thing I would mention is that go back to the training webinars that are appearing that we put up earlier on. Those, I think there'll be more added in the next week or two from what Phil was telling me the other day. And with the 11 or 12, ultimately, there'll be a lot of information coming through. So keep an eye on that. And that's on the ABHI website under Resource Hub. Also on that site, on that particular site and address, there is a survey for companies to complete who want to participate in the landscaping work that we're doing. My attitude is the more people who have their say, the more we can influence things in the future. And if we've got 400 responses, that's at least 10% of our sector. And people have to sit up and take note. But by all means, go onto the survey when you're looking at those webinars and follow up with it. And in fact, John kindly has put the survey details on there. Thank you very much. And he's also answered the other question which I'd got. This is open-ended, and we have another Q&A session set for the 16th of September, and we'll follow up with more information on that. But the training webinars will keep being posted. The survey will be there at least for another couple of months. And we will be running this session again. And from the response we've had today, I think it's been great. And all it remains for me to do now is to thank Phil and Steve for their input. These guys know a lot of stuff, and I'm delighted that we've been able to share their experience with a wider audience, because it's complex, it's getting harder and more expensive, and having a good source of information is a great thing. And I always say these guys have got the backbone to the MHRA. I think it's much bigger than that. They have an inside knowledge and an insight on where things are headed. And maybe next time when the consultations are moving forward, we'll be able to project this a little bit more in terms of what the future of regulation is actually going to look like, which I know is a favourite topic of Phil's, if not Steve's, probably Steve's as well. Anyway, thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thanks for the great questions, and thanks for sharing, Andy. Really appreciate it.
No problem.
Absolutely.
Bye.